Welcome to The Breakdown with Dr. Earl, a mental health podcast. This is Dr. Earl Turner, a licensed psychologist and psychology professor in Los Angeles. Just a few disclaimers. The Breakdown podcast is not intended to replace working with a licensed mental health professional. The podcast is only intended to provide educational information and discuss psychology as it applies to your daily life. Welcome back to The Breakdown. This is Dr. Earl. Thank you for joining me today for another episode of The Breakdown with Dr. Earl. On today's episode, we're discussing faulty wiring. So recently, I started this 5-series episode, which is focusing on reprogramming your soul. And so for episode 2, I wanted to talk a little bit about how our wiring, so to speak, is connected to our soul, but also how that helps us in terms of our emotional functioning. So I sort of came up with this episode in terms of thinking about, if we have faulty wiring, that sometimes it can lead to damage. It can also cause things to not function properly. So if we think about someone, building a house and the electrical system has some faulty wiring, that is problematic, right? Because if somehow those wires have a sort of spark that's not supposed to be there, it can lead to a fire and maybe damage to the house. And so if we think about how our thoughts or the wiring system within our brain that helps us emotionally, if that sort of thought processing or wiring is not working effectively, so to speak, then it can lead us to have some emotional difficulties, or it can lead us to engage in behaviors that may be unhealthy to us, or that may prevent us from maybe even doing the things that we may want to do. As a psychologist, I have, worked with a lot of clients that have experienced things like anxiety and depression. And one of the things that I oftentimes talk with them about is how our thoughts can impact or influence our emotions as well as our actions. One of the ways that I think is really helpful, for you to understand your own sort of wiring system and your thought processes is that if you are having thoughts that are problematic or preventing you from living up to your full potential, or maybe even adding more stress to your life, then you do want to be able to figure out, how can I maybe reprogram my thought processes, or to prevent some of these unhealthy or even irrational thoughts that may lead to some negative mood, for yourself. One thing that we sort of talk about in relation to our thought processes and understanding how it's connected to our behavior and our mood is something that's referred to as the cognitive triad. And basically, when we think about the cognitive triad from a psychological perspective, it's about understanding how our thoughts that we have can be in relation to how we think about ourselves and how we view ourselves, how we think about the world in which we live, but also thinking about our future within that world and in different spaces as well. And so we can have these negative or irrational beliefs that can really prevent us from feeling happy, from being able to engage in doing activities that we may enjoy, or maybe doing activities that may be required of us to do in our day-to-day lives, such as, going to work. And maybe you have to like give a presentation that you may be nervous about, or maybe you're not the best public speaker, or you don't like speaking in front of large crowds, your wiring system can really impact how you may perform in that situation. So I want to talk just for a little bit about some of the common irrational types of beliefs that people have. And obviously, I will post in the show notes for people that may be more interested, a link to learn more about the different types of cognitive distortions that people experience. But I wanted to touch on just a couple, just to sort of give you a sense about how these types of beliefs, or again, sort of these faulty wiring, can have some negative impact on you as a person. This episode was brought to you by Turner Psychological and Consulting Services. We offer workshops and trainings for the public and professional audiences on mental health awareness and diversity and inclusion. We also offer consultation for expert witness testimony. For booking, contact info@drerlangerturner.com. So this first cognitive distortion that we talk about is referred to as all or nothing thinking. Sometimes people refer to it as, this black and white thinking. And so one of the things that can happen for people that may exhibit all or nothing thinking is that if they, let's say, are a perfectionist and that they have to sort of perform at this extreme high level, if they don't do that, then it can lead them to maybe experiencing some negative mood, or maybe not wanting to continue to pursue that particular goal because they think that it's not going to be reachable. And so I really think it's important that you not sort of have this all or nothing thinking, because it can be detrimental to how you sort of think about yourself in that moment, but also how you can think about yourself in the future as well. Another type of cognitive distortion is catastrophizing. And I know that this is probably something that a lot of people experience at different time points. But for some people, this is one of their sort of common ways that they think about themselves or the world. And so when people catastrophize, as is sort of, I think most of us would probably know what that sort of terminology or definition means, basically means that you're thinking the worst in every situation. And so I think for some people who have sort of catastrophizing thoughts, that they may be seen by others as, overreacting often in situations. For the individual themselves, they may experience some sense of like panic in the situation. And because of that, it can really have a huge impact on their mood. It could maybe lead to some more anxiety about a particular situation. And it may even prevent them from wanting to try. And so I think in terms of thinking about maybe an example about catastrophizing is that, let's say someone has witnessed an event. And I know that for people who may have grew up in the families where maybe your parents were divorced, sometimes individuals can go into relationships with this sort of catastrophic thinking that, marriage is not going to work. And so why even date and get married? And so I think that is another type of belief that you really want to be mindful of and recognize that if you find yourself in different situations always thinking the worst, then you're probably not going to feel as good about different situations. So you do want to think about that as well. And I'll come back to some ways to sort of how do you undo some of these irrational beliefs and thinking as well before we wrap up. But the final one that I wanted to talk about is called mental filtering. And so this is one that is really common in a lot of people. Definitely, I've seen it in some of my clients that may experience things like depression, where you only focus in on the negative things. You have a real hard time focusing in on positive things or things that may be going well. And so basically with mental filtering, you interpret situations with this sort of negative filter or lens. And you sometimes, I would say, people who may exhibit mental filtering is that they're almost like looking out for the bad stuff. And so it's really important that you check yourself. Like if you catch yourself always like pointing out the bad stuff that's going to happen to you or the stuff that didn't go well in a situation, you may want to, one, acknowledge that, okay, hey, I'm doing this to myself and I'm maybe setting myself up to fail in different situations because I'm always pointing out the negative. So obviously, these are things that, people experience at different sort of levels, sometimes depending on the situation. I think people may experience some of these cognitive distortions, but just because you sort of have those types of distortions doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be bad. When it becomes bad, or let's say detrimental to your own sort of mental health, as an example, is because you're not able to take that cognitive distortion and also think about sort of the whole picture. And so I think that's one important piece that you want to sort of recognize, is that you want to look at everything that's going on, not just focus in on this sort of one small component. One of the things that I talk a lot about with some of my clients that I work with is this idea about cognitive restructuring. And we do this for people that have been to therapy before. One of the types of treatments is cognitive behavioral therapy, which uses some of these aspects of cognitive restructuring. And basically, part of cognitive restructuring is first recognizing some of those cognitive distortions that I mentioned earlier in terms of, mental filtering or catastrophizing. And then once you are able to identify those types of, faulty wiring, quote unquote, or cognitive distortions, then you want to be able to figure out, well, how can I look at the whole picture, or what is this sort of flip side of the coin, so to speak, so that I can reframe or change some of these negative, thought patterns that I may have conditioned myself to think over time. So these are just a list of questions that you can maybe think about to like check yourself in those situations when you may be experiencing some type of cognitive distortion. So one, is this thought or belief that I have based on an emotion? So if I am anxious, if I am fearful, if I am sad, is that the reason why I'm having these negative thoughts? And obviously, in those situations, our mood can also impact our thinking. So I do want people to understand, there is a connection between our mood and our thinking. So it's not always just our thinking impacts our mood, but it can also go the other way. Another thing that's really important is that when you begin to recognize that you're having these negative thoughts or cognitions, is to sort of check for evidence. Like, what evidence do I have that if I don't, let's say, get an A on this exam, that I'm going to flunk out of college? So maybe that is irrational, because just because you get, let's say, an A minus or a B, you can still graduate and be successful, despite, maybe having this standard or goal that you've set for yourself. So really think about, what evidence do I have to prove that these beliefs are actually reality for me in those situations? And then being able to maybe sometimes ask others. I think it's helpful to get others' opinions. I know that for many people, we sometimes check in, with our friends or family members about different situations. So it can be really helpful to get another perspective about situations, to see, like, am I exaggerating or overthinking in this situation? Or is there evidence that I don't see that maybe someone else can be able to see and sort of point out for me? For me, having these types of discussions, I also want to let people know that, this is only sort of a small clip to have you think about how your thoughts can connect to your emotions and your behavior. And so if you are someone who is experiencing some type of mental health difficulty, anxiety, depression, do make sure that you check in with the therapists in your community, so that they can be able to help you to understand, what may be at the root of why you've had these thoughts and how sort of your views about yourself or about the world has maybe contributed to why you may be more likely to experience these different types of negative cognitive distortions. So I appreciate you all for tuning in to the podcast. Definitely check out the show notes for the resources about different types of cognitive distortions, or if you're interested in finding a therapist that can maybe be able to help you to work through some of these cognitive distortions that you may be experiencing that may be having a negative impact on how you may be feeling. So make sure that you follow me on social media. You can look me up at Dr. Earl Turner. You can also come back and check out other episodes of the podcast on your favorite streaming platform. Thanks for joining me for The Breakdown, a mental health podcast. And remember, you set your mindset. Be well and tune in for the next episode of The Breakdown with Dr. Earl.